In this video, I'm going to show you how we can use configuration settings in our development environment. First, let's talk about what configuration variables are. These are just variables that we'll use in our application to configure things like keys for various API services like Mixpanel or AWS, or just custom application variables that we want to have accessible in our app. There's two types of configuration variable files. The first is called env.sh, and this is short for environment, as in environment variables. And the second is settings.json, which is where we'll put our Meteor settings JSON object. Let's start off with environment variables, and then we'll move on to Meteor settings. So we'll open up the env.sh file and start creating a few environment variables that we can then access inside of our applications or from within packages. Environment variables are just a way in Unix for different programs to communicate with each other using global variables. What we can do to create an environment variable is to use the export keyword. This tells Unix to export the variable into the current shell and then into any forked shells. So we can create a variable, let's just call it a custom variable, and then give it some value. For example, typically the values are some kind of string. Now, you'll often use environment variables for things like Amazon AWS keys or Mixpanel keys or things like that. But here's a couple of examples from the Meteor documentation where you'll use environment variables for running production apps. So here's an example of the port variable and the Mongo URL variable. And you'll often also be using the root URL. So these are other examples of environment variables that you'll use often and are good candidates to put in our env.sh file. Next, let me show you how to use our new custom variable inside of the application. So I'll open up app.js, and the first thing to note is that environment variables are only available on the server. So inside of the server if block, I can access all of the environment variables using the process object and the .env property. So if I wanted to print out all of the environment variables that are available to me, I could just go ahead and print out process.env. But since I just want to see the variable that we just created, I can access that using its name like this. One pattern you'll see often is checking to see whether a value exists as an environment variable, and if not, then to use the default value from the application. So it might look something like this. And then we'll use the OR guard and say that by default the value for this variable is development. So if you see this kind of code, you know that it's giving you a chance to configure the variable using environment variables, and it will default to something else if none is provided. So for now, let's just go start up this application and see that we print our custom variable to the console. From within inside my project directory, not the Meteor directory, but the outer project directory, the first thing I need to do is to bring those environment variables into the current environment. And to do that, I can use the source command of bash. And what I need to do is pass a path to a particular environment file. So in this case, I'll say source config, and then my current environment, which is development, and then the file, which is env.sh. So that'll bring all those environment variables into the current environment. More specifically, it'll just execute that env shell file. Next up, I need to change into my app directory, and then we can run our app as usual using the Meteor command. Once the app starts up, notice that we print the value of our environment variable to the console. So this is a really nice way to store things like configuration keys on the server. Next, let's look at Meteor settings. The settings file is going to be a JSON object that gets converted into a JavaScript object and assigned to the Meteor settings property. It has the added benefit of the fact that we can use it on the client as well as the server. Let's create an example one. I've created a JSON object here, and it just has one key called SomeKey and a value of SomeValue. Now, this key and value pair will be available on the server. But I can also create another key here called public And these will be available on all connected browser clients. And so I can call this a public key, public value, and we'll take a look at that in the browser. Let's go over to our application JavaScript file and use these settings. I'm going to get rid of all this client code because we're not really using it. Now on the server, we can access Meteor settings like this. I'm going to say Meteor settings. And then down here, I'll just say environment variables so that we can differentiate. And so all of the Meteor settings are going to be available as an object on the server like this. And on the client, I'll print out to the console Meteor settings, and you'll see in this case, we only see the public settings. Now let's jump over and start the app. From inside the Meteor application folder, we can use these settings by using the Meteor command like before, but using a settings flag and passing the path to the settings file. In this case, the settings file is going to be under the config development settings JSON file. Notice on the server that we get access to all of the Meteor settings, including the public key and then all of the properties over here. And then just like before, right below that, we're displaying all the environment variable values or our custom value right here. Now let's pop over to the browser. In the browser JavaScript debugger, notice that we're printing out the settings object here, and the only settings that are available are the ones under this public key. Another place we can see where these Meteor settings were set is by right-clicking on the browser and looking at View Page Source. And notice up here in this global variable called Meteor Runtime Config, there is a public settings property, and that is where these public settings are going. And notice that our private key and value are not visible here. Now, one of the reasons for having a configuration folder like this with different folders for development versus test versus production is that our environment settings may very well change between when we're on development and when we're in production. For example, you might have an Amazon S3 bucket that you use only for development and a different one that you use when you're in production. And your environment settings would be a great place to put those key values. In this video, I showed you two ways that we can configure application variables. One using Unix environment variables and the other using Meteor settings, the JSON file. And then we looked at how to use both of those in our development environment using the Meteor command line tool.